I have to admit I did a little bit more research or study on this week's gospel, because as I read it and I began to prepare, thinking how the gospel affects me and what does it call me to how to change my life, I found I had a little conflict between what I was talking about last week about how when you go to somebody that wrongs you, and then if they don't pay attention, then you bring somebody else, and then if they don't pay attention to that, then you go to the higher church. And then the one line that I didn't really understand that much of last week's was, well, then you treat them like a Gentile. Well, I thought, like most of us, that, well, if you treat them like a Gentile, they're out. They're out of here. You know? And as I was reflecting on that today, thinking, well, if last week we talked about, you're out of here, this week we're called to always forgive. And I had a conflict with that. I really had to look into that a little bit and going, so first of all, I did some scripture, reading some commentaries and stuff, and found out that the amount that this guy owed the king, he more than likely was a tax collector like Matthew, and that's a connection for Matthew. And he probably was with the tribute, and he didn't turn everything in, going forward. And the amount he owed was equivalent, if you gained the day wage of that time, was 1 denarius a day. He owed 160,000 denarii to the king, which meant he'd have to work nonstop, no vacation, 7 days a week for 160,000 years. Not going to happen. Okay? Not going to happen. Nobody's wild. Even if he passed it down to his family, he'd still be paying. If you think of it, he'd still be paying for that. The other part of it that was interesting when I was trying to understand that, treat him like a Gentile going forward, Matthew was a tax collector and considered on the outside. And one of the ways that Jesus got included or invited people in that were outside the normal realm of things, for Matthew, he went to his home with other tax collectors, sat down and ate. They prayed and they had a discussion, and Matthew then became a disciple. So part of that reading from last week is not only going one-on-one with other people and then treating them like a Gentile. If you treat them like a Gentile, the community is called to respond to help people stay whole and become part of a larger group going forward. So for me, that gave me a context why we have to, or why the Lord said, you have to forgive 77 times. Because in the scripture at this time, the rabbis said 3 times, it's enough, then you can kick them out. Okay, Peter was thinking, well, I'm going to be better than those rabbis, I'm going to do 7. And what this part of Matthew's gospel is, this chapter that we're in the last part of the chapter, and then Matthew's, the structure of the gospel in this chapter 18, is what he wants the community to do. What are those new guidelines or rules or manner of living that they're supposed to do, and being the disciples, they have to incorporate that more into their lives. And one of the main categories or characteristics is you have to forgive. And it's not just, okay, I forgive you. From your heart, in the bottom of your soul, you have to forgive that person, no matter what it takes. Now, we could talk about different types of things in forgiveness, but the initial call, the prophetic call, is to forgive in such a way that not only do we forgive the other person, but through that forgiveness, the other person could change and we change. Because one of the other parts of the commentaries that I read had an interesting side note. It said, forgiving all the time is kind of like, if you think about it, and I could do that as a priest, how many people come to confession sometimes once a month, once every 2 weeks, whatever your regularity is, and a lot of times they say, Father, I just can't get over this. I'm doing the same thing all the time. I just can't really get out of it. And my usually words of consolation, if there are any, says, well, keep working at it, and just think how bad you'd be if you didn't confess it. If you didn't get the grace of the sacrament to help you change. If you didn't come in and say, I still need to work on this, and it's going to take me some time. And sometimes the time is a lifelong process. So today in this gospel, it's not just saying that we're going to forgive. It's forgiving from the heart that encourages us to trust in the presence of the Lord in our midst, that helps us to change and live differently, and hopefully invites others to change so that they could encounter God in their life.